So to begin our session, I would like to invite Mr. Herath Gunatilake, the Director of the Environment and Safeguards Division here at ADB, to the stage.
Thank you, Erin. So here I'm going to give you a very, very brief introduction about mitigation banking, and the expert panel has, some experts who have actually worked on mitigation banking and knows every details. We have some presentation on mitigation banking, but my introduction is to only set the scene. Now, what is mitigation banking? Actually, the most important part of the mitigation banking is that this notion that if you are destroying some part of the ecosystem for a development purpose, so you do a compensatory action to ensure that in the location itself or somewhere else, you create the same ecological asset somewhere. So that is the basic essence of a mitigation banking. Now, the most important thing about a mitigation banking is that, in my view, is that it integrates development and environment. It considers both. I mean, if you go to the history of the environmentalism as far back as 1970s, 80s, we always separate development from environment, and then development happens, then environment get damaged. That is the kind of perception we all had in the past. But there's a lot of talk about the need to really integrate development and consider environment as part of the development. Then only you have the right kind of approach to the environment and development both. If you ignore environment and try to protect the environment, it doesn't work. And if you go to the other end, it doesn't work. The mitigation banking allow both development and environment protection to take place, while providing incentives for the private sector to provide that service on profitable basis. So there's no need to have additional, push. Once the incentives are created in the economy for private sector to provide something on profitable basis, it will sustain on its own. So what are the advantages of mitigation banking? Basically, I'm sure the experts will shed more light on that, but let me just highlight a few things. One is that it reduces the uncertainty over whether compensatory mitigation will be successful in offsetting a project impact. Now, if I am a project developer and if I am doing the compensatory action by myself using my own company as a project developer company, there's no certainty that I can have a mitigation restoration action by my company on a timely basis with the assurance that it will really offset the impact. Whereas the mitigation banking system has a certified assets, like certified wetlands that can be purchased by a project developer who can then, there's no uncertainty about the mitigation action. It is verified already. Attached to this is also the time saving. If our project developers are trying to do all this work, they need to keep certain expertise within construction companies, ecologists and engineers and others, which is not really economically efficient and which can also lead to a lot of delays and other things. Here, you have readily available mitigation banks, wetlands or other ecosystems. To get your permit from the government to do your property development, you just approach them, buy it, it's very quick. So that's time saving. And then, while having all these advantages to the developer, the conservation community and the regulator also find it easy because they know the system even before they allocate any part of these restored ecosystems to a particular project. Everything is certified. even the cost of monitoring and compliance from the Environment Protection Agency, regulatory bodies, I'm sure the expert will shed light on that. It's easy for them, it's cost effective for them. So overall, this provides a win-win solution for property developers. They are from the development side, from the regulator, more cost-effective solution, and for this conservation community, it provides a win-win solution because the certified restored ecological assets will be sustained by the bankers forever to ensure that the destruction happen in some places fully compensated. So with that little remarks, I believe that the mitigation banking is one of the most innovative ideas. I would even consider it as the crown of the jewel of green businesses. But the question is actually more pertinent question is rather than praising what happened, we have to appreciate what happened and recognize this, but whether we can really use this kind of flexible, innovative approaches in this region. I'm sure the experts will give more information as to what are the success factors behind this. But a couple of things maybe we have to be very careful about the governance regime, the capacity of the regulatory agencies. These are two key factors, and then probably also land ownership. So these things might decide whether we can really go for this kind of flexibility. I mean, governance is important. If we are in a very poor governance situation, you can have a situation where there are a lot of, wetlands in the books, but nothing on the ground. So this kind of extreme situation can happen under very poor governance circumstances. So that's why we have to really have a very closer look at these things and see. The whole objective of this session is to see whether we can, borrow some of these ideas, probably amend them a little bit to suit to our situations and whether we can apply them. With that, I finish my opening remarks. So now I will invite Douglas perhaps to make a presentation on drinking water and municipal infrastructure. I'm sorry, he's a Division Chief, Drinking Water and Municipal Infrastructure Branch of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Douglas will talk about not directly on mitigation banking, but a related concept of the ecosystem service payment. He might also shed some light between these two concepts. So he will mainly talk about the New York City's experience in trying to pay for the ecosystem services rather than trying to do engineering solutions to ensure that New York City gets clean water, using the nature's own systems, which also gives some core benefits compared to the technical solutions. Douglas, yours.
See how this works. Good morning. Thank you to ADB for having this conference and for allowing me to participate. As we heard at the opening yesterday, it pays to be green and let nature do its job. And this project's a good example. I'll touch on some ecosystem services and some potential opportunities for investing in land conservation. I'll also provide examples of incentivizing, providing co-benefits that protect the environment, save money, and improve overall quality of life. Which way am I pointing this? Okay, maybe next. All right. I'll provide a brief overview of the New York City drinking water system, discuss the policy and legal background on EPA's decision to grant New York City a waiver from the federal requirement to filter its water, discuss multi-party partnerships, highlight some elements of the city's watershed protection program and partnerships, discuss how this program compares to other watershed programs around the country, and discuss money, various EPA funding programs that we have to deal with water and wastewater infrastructure. And there's also web links throughout the presentation that I think will be helpful to take a look at after as you refer to the slides. Oops. Okay. Good. Okay. All right, let's talk about New York City. It's one of the largest unfiltered surface water supplies in the world. It's cheaper to protect the water at the source than to treat it afterwards. And I think that's the simple definition of ecosystem services, let nature do its job. There's approximately 1.3 billion gallons of water per day that's delivered to 9 million people. The watershed is over 2,000 square miles in size and reaches over 125 miles in 8 counties. The amazing thing is 95% of the water is delivered by gravity. Only 5% is actually pumped, and that's just to keep the pressure differential going. There's 19 reservoirs and 3 controlled lakes. Now, what's the cost of filtering? Now, a filtration plant large enough to filter the Catskill, Delaware part of the system, the Croton system is actually filtered now because of all the development that happened around it. It was just, the decision was made on the abundance of safety to just filter that part of it. But just dealing with the larger system would be $10 billion and another $110 million annually in operation and maintenance. Now, what's the cost of protecting the watershed? It's about $100 million a year. In addition, there are health and safety issues that could arise with filtration. Significantly higher levels of disinfection would be needed to purify the water. And byproducts from these chemicals are known to cause serious health effects, and it could cause damage to some of the fittings in the system as well. Now let's talk about, regulations, and obviously that sort of sets the baseline for environmental protection. Our mandate is through the Safe Drinking Water Act, and specifically the Surface Water Treatment Rule, which requires that all surface water all drinking water taken from surface water be filtered to remove microbial contaminants. However, the Surface Water Treatment Rule has a little provision in it that says if you can show that the water supply can show that you meet a strict set of criteria, then you don't have to filter. And you'll see that some of the criteria are on this slide. Note the watershed control criteria. The rule requires that the water supplier control all human activities in the watershed that may have an adverse impact on the microbiological quality of the surface water. That's a pretty high bar. And relief is the exception, not the rule. Nationwide, excluding New York, only 6 water systems that serve over 100,000 people are able to avoid filtration. And most of these are either state, federal parks around them. They don't have the type of development and agricultural component that this watershed has. Let's talk about the elements. As I said earlier, it's all about watershed protection or ecosystem services, natural capital, or spend $10 billion to build a filtration plant. The benefits of the natural system include water purification, flood protection, aquatic productivity, fishing, ecosystems, and recreation, canoeing, boating, tourism. The total cost that the city has spent to date and probably will end up spending to comply with this is about $1.2 billion overall in watershed protection. There's still $9 billion ahead. It sounds like a pretty good deal to me. Many elements of this program are shown on the slide. I'm going to focus on 2, which are highlighted. I'm going to talk about the ecosystem services component specifically and break it down into land acquisition, conservation easements, and farm rescue, and our watershed agricultural program. They have the most direct link, I think, to the mitigation banking concept of where we're trying to protect land. Land acquisition purchases are undertaken selectively with properties prioritized for purchase based on the presence of key natural features such as streams, wetlands, proximity of the land to reservoirs, and the potential for development. Land is only purchased from willing sellers, and it's at a fair market price. Prior to purchasing the land, New York City consults with local governments to ensure the community interests are taken into account. And they can exempt certain areas from the land acquisition program. Conservation easements, these are the more, I think, innovative area where we are right now. Consistent with national trends in the United States, 60% of farmers within the New York City watershed are reaching retirement age or struggling to break even and don't have a viable transition plan. At the same time, the growing demand for transparency in our food production and unmet demand for local food is estimated at almost $4 billion a year within 3 hours from this watershed region, which presents opportunities. Conservation easements provide landowners with the opportunity to preserve family land and get some funds at the same time while protecting water quality. Without conservation easements, the land could easily be sold to developers and pose a potential threat to water quality. With easements, the protection stays with the land and not the owner. This is one of the newer parts of the program that's sort of in a pilot approach, is farm rescue. Another threat to land preservation is farm foreclosure and the inability of the young next generation farmers. Believe it or not, there's a lot of young people that want to get into farming, that they don't have the money and the capital to buy the land and to start their own production. So to combat this, a temporary in-fee acquisition program is being developed to allow a private entity to purchase properties that are at a high risk for foreclosure or distress. The private investment money buys the land. The investor gets an immediate return by getting a conservation easement on the land, and then they can lease the land to young farmers and get a further return on their investment, thereby allowing the young farmers to get a start in the watershed and generating some income from it at the same time. Now let's talk about the farming. The main theme in the farm program within the watershed is working landscapes and protecting water quality. There's over 300 farms in the watershed, but they are also a potential source of pathogens and nutrients to source water. The objective of the agricultural program is to improve water quality. It's a multi-barrier approach. We have source control, transport pollutant reduction, and prevention of contaminants getting into waterways. What we have is agricultural engineers work to develop whole farm plans, agricultural best management practices, riparian buffers, nutrient management, water conservation, and education to teach farmers what the latest technology. I think we heard a lot about technology, maybe in a green business sense, but there's also the technology of greening farming, which is also a green business in a certain sense. And we're also looking to promote organic farming and sustainable farming to keep locally grown food within the area rather than having to ship it in and decrease carbon footprints. Just briefly, I want to touch on other watershed programs in the U.S., and there's a really interesting document that was produced by the World Resources Institute, Protecting Drinking Water at the Source, and Lessons It Learned, and they looked at 13 different water programs across the U.S. Now, how does New York City stack up against most of them? Well, most of them have similar approaches, but New York has the larger population, a larger volume of water. I think the significant incentive of the filtration avoidance is a driver, but more importantly, it's fully funded. New York City pays for everything that's part of the program. And most of the other programs, they're hodgepodges of funding sources, and they don't have all the money they need to do the watershed protection. And lastly, what's interesting about the New York City water system is that because it's so diverse, you can easily have a drought in one spot, but you still have a lot of water in another spot. If there's a terrorist or security concern, different parts of the watershed can be shut on and off. So again, it has that resilient component built into it to help address climate change as well. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and just talk a little bit about the funding and financing that we bring to the table. And this kind of applies to all programs in EPA, but particularly the water and wastewater industry. We have the Clean and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund programs. We have the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. And we have the Water Infrastructure and Resilience Finance Center. And then we have local EPA regional environmental finance centers. The EPA Clean and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund are grants we give to the states who give out low interest to no interest grants or loans to municipalities for water and wastewater projects. It's federally funded, but there's a 20% match requirement. There's flexibility in how we provide the assistance. But through 2014, the Clean Water Fund alone has provided 46,350 assistance agreements to communities, financing $128 billion in projects. And the Drinking Water Program has executed 2,300 agreements with $7.6 billion in funding. The Drinking Water Program is newer than the Clean Water Program, so that's why the disparity. So innovation, we've got this act that was passed, the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, and again, the web links have a lot more information that I could provide in this program. But the idea is to fund innovation in addition to the State Revolving Fund program. So this would be another form of seed money that could be accessed by municipalities and states to practice innovation in water and wastewater treatment. We also created a Resiliency Finance Center. And a lot of this came out of some of the more devastating storms that have hit in the East Coast in particular and southern parts of the United States, to how do we develop resiliency and build that structure into our water and wastewater systems. And we have 10 EPA regional environmental finance centers scattered throughout the U.S. to help assist local areas deal with their local problems. And I just wanted to close with some questions to consider. What advice would panelists give to our audience that would help them be successful? And then to me, it's all about communication, education, outreach. I think we heard a lot about that today. And how do we get to people today when they're being assaulted with all different kinds of information? How do you get your message through to them and teach them what you have to offer? So just some things to think about. But thank you.
Inspiring example where you make some profit by saving your extra cost on the engineering structures to purify your water, but in the meantime you do a lot of good things. You do conservation farming, you reduce the pollution load, you let the nature does this job in a proper way by managing the upper watershed. I think the private business leaders in the podium should be inspired by this. Many private businesses need clean water. I think this is the kind of approach that private companies should use more and more to secure their clean water for their businesses. Thank you again, Douglas, for your excellent presentation. And let me now invite Mark Laska, the founder and president of the Great Ecology, managing partner of Tellurium Partners. I hope I said it right. And Mark will make a presentation on the wetland banking.
All right, thank you, Harath, for creating the context and setting the stage, and Douglas for giving us a look into one program. I'm from New York City, and I grew up drinking the water there, and it's really good. I also want to thank the ADB for inviting me to speak to you today. So yesterday, I sat on a plenary panel, and I talked about 4 vital ingredients. And the 4 vital ingredients to creating a successful wetland banking program in the US were regulations, people with knowledge to deploy those regulations, investors willing to invest capital, and stakeholders to keep the pressure high. So I corresponded with Ellie Bacani at the bank here, and she said, come on, there's got to be more than 4. So I came up with 10. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this presentation, if I can figure out how to move it forward. Not that one. Okay, so a brief outline of my presentation. I just want to touch upon the regulations that protect natural resources in the US. I want to give a brief history of mitigation banking and ecosystem services banking in the US. A little brief about how the system has grown over time. My 10 key factors, thank you, Ellie, for pushing me on that one, and then quickly a couple of case studies. Okay, so with that in mind, the US is extremely protective of natural resources. There's a huge volume of regulations. The regulations are at the federal level. Many of them actually are imposed by the EPA, by Douglas's organization. They're at the state level, and they're in the local level. Some of the most predominant ones I've listed there, the biggest of the big one is the Clean Water Act, which comes up with the notion called no net loss of wetlands. And no net loss of wetlands is the basis for preserving wetlands and creating the Wetland Mitigation Bank concept. The notion of no net loss of wetlands means, as Harath said, if you affect it here, if you adversely impact wetlands or completely destroy them here, you got to put them back somewhere there. And there's all sorts of formulas and calculations that we use to figure out how many we put back. So the regulations protect the habitat. So ecosystem banking is really just the notion that the mitigation offsets that are planned from the infrastructure projects that end up harming the environment can can be replaced by projects elsewhere, and that these projects can be done by third parties. So what do I mean by third parties? What I mean by a third party is a private investor can come in and purchase land and conduct a project and quantify the habitat uplift, how much they've improved ecosystem functions, how much wetlands they've brought back, and then sell those credits to the developers that need them under the regulatory programs. That's really it. So we've talked a little bit in the last day and a half about payment for ecosystem services. Where this differs, where this departs, is that we're not preserving ecosystem services necessarily, we're improving them. And I'm going to show you a picture of that right here. So what do I mean by that? The top picture is just a cross-section. It's a made-up cross-section of a wetland habitat. And you can imagine that it's got low ecological functioning. And that's graphic on the left side of that kind of portrays the notion that it's not really performing very well. And obviously, the graphic below that is of a higher ecological function. You can see diversity within the structure of the aquatic system. You could see a lot of plants around. We put a little picture of a little person standing there to show public access. And the graphic that I have on the left side in green, I chose that color on purpose, represents the uplift. And that uplift is what is monetized. The uplift is the credit. So that's the key notion. I improved the habitat, I brought it from here to here, and I generated a credit. And that's what I'm going to sell. Okay, I'm not going to dwell on this slide. There's a lot of information there. Suffice it to say, and this is relevant to the topic in the conference, and I hope that some of the panelists address this. Mitigation banking started 25 years ago, and it took many, many, many improvements to make that system work. So in 1992, there were 46 banks. By 2015, there were 2,500. Today, we're approaching 3,000 banks that are out there. But it was not just one guy that came up with this idea and it worked. We had to refine it and improve it and refine it and improve it. And so this is the graph that's showing how the growth of the banking system in the US has occurred. It was, kind of on life support in the early years. It took a really long time for it to take off. And now I believe we're in exponential growth for a lot of reasons. So on the left side of the picture, the dots are all the mitigation banks that we have in the US. And you'll notice that a lot of them are in the interior of the country. And that's because freshwater banks, habitat banks, do not need coastal or tidal wetlands. There's a lot on the coast as well. There's a lot more in the east than in the west. There's a lot more land in the west. There's a lot less land in the east. There's a lot more water in the east. And every time you do any project on the eastern part of the US, you're touching water. And the market size today is estimated at roughly $1.5 billion in credit sales transacted every year. So it's a real market. It's a substantial market. It spawns about 250,000 jobs. Okay, here's my list of 10. Here's the 10 reasons that I think banking has worked successfully in the US. And I hope that you can all download this from the ADB website later if you want. If I think about it, there's probably more than 10, and I may even give you a bonus 11. But I'm not going to promise. It depends if I run out of time or not. Okay, so the first one, I already touched upon this. This is not just a key factor. This is a vital from vitae, life. Without the regulations, there is no banking success in the US. So the regulatory protection, the Clean Water Act, required no net loss of wetlands. That's how wetland mitigation banking started, but we now have species banking, conservation banking, water quality trading, natural resource damage banking. Each of those trading schemes spawn from a regulation that causes the enforcement of habitat protection. And that is key. It's not just a factor. Like I said, it's a vital ingredient for the success of the system. I have to keep my eye on the time here. The second, regional development. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that land is converted from pristine habitat to development. And there's a lot of different kinds of development each of you, by the way, one of the most amazing things for me the last 2 days has been meeting so many people from so many different countries that have such similar experiences in their countries. What we have is wide-scale development, waterfront development, infrastructure, roadways, transportation, real estate, energy, mining, waterfront development, shipping, terminals, and that's all I could fit on the slide. The list goes way, way, way longer. Without that development, there's nobody that needs a mitigation credit in the US. So the next thing that works in our favor, and this works in every country in Asia, is that we have habitat classification. We know what's out there. You cannot know what you've lost unless you know what you got, right? So without knowing what you got, how do you know what we've lost? We have studied the environment. I'm an ecologist. There's ecologists. There's armies of us out there studying habitat, defining it, and that's critical to know what is being impacted by one of these projects. Okay, so now, when I talked about mitigation banking, remember, I made the main point that this is different than ecosystem services payments. This is different because we have to go find habitat. Here's the good news and the really bad news. The good news is there's a lot of land that we can find that we could enhance, preserve, protect, restore. The bad news is there's a lot of land in the US that needs to be restored. There's been a lot of degradation. There's been wide-scale policies for well over a century that have degraded our wetlands from urbanization, from pollution, from industrialization, from just simply waterfront usage. So we have to go out and we have to find land and fix it. The next critical ingredient is a market demand. Without the project, there's no purchaser of a credit, and this is key for the private sector because I need somebody that has a project, that has money, that's willing to pay me for my credit. Without that, I don't have a banking system. Credit supplies. There's a lot of those projects. There's a lot of credits. There's probably around 20,000 wetland permits every year processed by the Army Corps under the Clean Water Act. So there's huge demand, but then there has to be a lot of projects. And the most successful banks are come from the projects where we have NGOs or stakeholder groups that are supporting those. The next key factor is being able to make a credit cost effectively. I've got to produce it for less money than I can sell it for. If I can spend $100,000 an acre on a credit and sell it for $200,000 an acre, that makes the investors very happy. If I can sell it for $500,000 an acre, that makes them even more happy. Finally, stakeholders. Without stakeholders, the system collapses. Somebody has to keep the pressure on the developers, the bankers, the investors, the regulators. Investor capital. Investors have to be willing to take the risk on mitigation bank. So there is no sure thing. There's no guaranteed money. Well, actually, I take it back. Occasionally, you can do a project where you know that the entity in need of the credit will purchase them up front and you're pre-financed. You pre-sell the credits. It's like a unicorn. It occurs every now and then, but you have to look really hard to find them. So for this to work, you need investor capital. And then finally, you need training. Manpower, womanpower, transfer of knowledge. We have to create and maintain and monitor these improvements. Now in the US, we're talking about 250,000 people that are employed in the banking industry right now. That is a huge business. That is big business right now. Okay, I had time. Good news. I talk quick. Hopefully it wasn't too quick for some people. So my bonus number 11 is you need a government driver. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the change in administration in the US. There was also just an interview this morning that was published where the president-elect backpedaled on just about everything that he said during the campaign. So there's a lot of posturing going on during the elections. What really happens, nobody knows. But here's what the last guy did. President Obama promoted in a presidential memo that came out in November of last year, of 2015, the notion that the US government is now encouraging private sector development of environmental credits. The government has opened themselves up and said, this is okay, this system has worked. We've got 25 years of demonstrated proof. We've got 3,000 wetland mitigation banks, great idea. We're gonna open this up and take it well beyond the Clean Water Act. And that's what that memo did, and it is now a gold rush in the US. investors, so I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a small business, I do consulting, I advise companies how to meet mitigation needs, I set up mitigation banks. Maybe I'll advise some of you on how to get the program running in your own country, whatever, that's what we do, we advise, but we also invest. So we identify projects, we bring those projects to investors, and we say, will you put money into these banks? And right now, it's like a gold rush. Investors cannot see enough projects. It's a very, very exciting time in the sector. Okay, so how do we make this work in Asia? Thankfully, there are people on the panel that are going to talk about how it actually is working in Asia. And I think we're in the very, very early stages. So I'm really excited to hear what the panel has to say about bringing it to this region. So let me just talk really, really quickly. I have less than 2 minutes left, and I'm going to just talk about how we develop a bank. So an investor looks at 3 things when they want to evaluate whether to invest. One is, can you build a project at the site? The second is, can I get a return on the investment when I invest in your project? And third, can I get this permitted? So when those questions are answered successfully, you have projects that work. So in 15 seconds, here is a project in San Diego, California, where I live now, when I moved out of New York. This is an 85-acre parcel owned by the Port of San Diego, so it's a municipal agency that owns it, and they've brought us in to create 53 credits that they believe will cost about $225,000 per credit to create, and we're going to sell them, we hope, for around $600,000. So 12 million in, 32 million out. We believe that's a pretty bankable investment, but that's a 10-year investment to get the return. Now, here's a project in Douglas's neck of the woods that we work on, the Kane Mitigation Bank. Now, this one, the land was already owned by an entity, and we've generated there's about 70 credits that will end up being sold that are now selling at about $1 million each. So the investors have done extremely well on this project. So the point is that there are many, many projects that can be very bankable and very investable. I showed you 2 examples that I love the numbers on. There are many more examples where it's a disaster. So the challenge in the region is to find out what will work here and be an investable project. Thank you very much. Appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for a very inspiring presentation on wetland banking. I'm sure the audience must have been inspired. There's a lot of money out there, and there's a lot of potential out there. And also, I would add one more thing, that from 1950s to mid-1970s, about 450,000 wetlands were destroyed annually in US. This wetland banking system actually significantly reduced this destruction. With that, let me join, let all of us join giving a big applause for Mark's excellent presentation.
Thank you very much to our first presenters who have now set the scene for our other panelists. So I'd like to invite to the stage Mr. Ritesh Kumar, Conservation Program Manager for Wetlands International South Asia. Next, I'd like to invite Mr. Ari Sudijanto, Director for Environmental Impact Prevention of Business and Activity, Directorate General for Forestry and Environmental Planning, Ministry of Environment and Forestry in Indonesia. Next, I'd like to invite Mr. Eng Sopalet, Undersecretary of State of the Ministry of Environment in Cambodia. Next, I'd like to invite Mr. Simon Baptist, Chief Economist and Managing Director for Asia at the Economist Intelligence Unit. And finally, I'd like to invite Mr. Matthias Gelber, co-founder of Maleki.
Thank you, Erin. Now let me first invite Ritesh to give provide some comments on the first 2 presentations. Especially, I would like Ritesh to reflect on how these inspiring flexible instruments can be introduced in our region, and in your view what are the barriers and what are the potentials, and also reflect on, whether, this is actually doable in this region based on your experience.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the two presentations, pretty exciting. Let me take a step back. In the year 2010, Wetlands International and a couple of organizations were tasked to compile economic values of wetlands. And the publication is in the form of the economics, the TEEB, Water and Wetlands Synthesis. One of the key conclusions of the analysis was that wetlands were indeed very valuable, and that was not a surprising story, but the opportunity cost of restoring a hectare of wetland was also pretty high. So it made absolutely no sense to allow wetlands to degrade. Yet, when you compare the value estimates with the trends of wetland loss, we also come to a situation wherein we see trends slowing down in North America, settling down in Europe. But in Asia, wetlands are amongst the most rapidly degrading ecosystems, unfortunately. And the trends in wetland-dependent species is also more horrific. So there is time to act. Now, in the last about 50 years, the public policy for wetlands has borrowed largely from terrestrial systems. We have done to wetlands what we did to our forests. We have been drawing protected areas, and we have been pushing for inclusion of more wetlands under protected areas. We have pushed more public subsidy-led approaches. And yet, these trends are appalling. So there is something wrong, and you need newer approaches. Even the Ramsar Convention wise use principles, very nice to say, but the balance between conservation and development is yet to be seen in good number of restoration projects. I think even Ramsar Convention has the highest number of red-listed sites in Asia, and not more than 5 or 6 restoration projects to date. So something needs to change, and one of the critical, when you look at all analyses and assessments, they put private sector and economic development as drivers of wetland costs. And at the same time, to add another piece to the puzzle is, the funding for wetland restoration is still not there. For every $100 that we need for wetland restoration today, less than $1 or $2 are available with the government. So there's no money, wetlands are being lost, ecosystem services are nowhere to be accounted for. So private sector needs to be a part of the solution. This is well recognized in the international policy making within governments. And I see as an organization, Wetland Mitigation Banking as one of the proactive steps to get this sector on board. Yet, I also see Asia less prepared to leapfrog into such a solution. And some of the reasons why I say this is, when you look back to the two presentations, one of the biggest, I think, milestone is no net loss approach. Until unless you have a policy of no net loss, things are not going to change. And when you do a review of all policies, this reflection of no net loss, there are semblances here and there. But in general, I find those missing. The second is, actually, I can log into the website and see where your wetlands are, right? I can't do that for much of our countries. Here is Sri Lanka, Indonesia. The information on the stock itself is very fragmented. We need to improve our information base so that a developer can actually log into a public information system and say, okay, I'm going to impact on this system, and can I then talk to my government on what are the possibilities? The third, yesterday, you also mentioned on how can the government, beyond providing funding, can provide confidence to the private sector on regulatory consistency. Now, those consistencies are far from being reached. These are evolving. Wetland policies, at the best, in Asia, is a work in progress. Certain countries are in advanced stages. Certain countries do not have a separate wetland policy as yet. And those political milestones are missing. So until unless public finance is able to give confidence to the private sector for consistent policy making, I see us working for another decade at least to see those projects materialize in Asia Pacific. And finally, it's also about restoration capabilities. Within the region, I think there is a lot to learn, a lot to share. The way we manage our restoration is a mix of engineering and a mix of social engineering that is done. There's a lot more cultural values that we attach to our wetlands. And I think those dimensions, those models are emerging. but there is a big role for agencies like ADB, Wetlands International, to get those more recognized so that concepts of wetland mitigation banking can actually flourish. But at the same time, let me admit the story is not that grim. I think without public sector, private sector participation, I don't see a way out of the puzzle. And from the interesting case studies both of you presented, I think we still need to reflect and work onto those on a mutual basis. Thanks.
Thank you, Ritesh. The message is clear. We are destroying most of our wetlands. There's no money to restore them. And then we also have capacity issues, and we also have lack of suitable regulatory measures like no net loss kind of regulation. That's the message. It's clear, challenges are there, but in one hand, we have these inspiring examples. On the other hand, we have challenging situations with the dire needs. Let's see how we can match them. And let me now invite Ari to talk a little bit about Indonesia's perspective on broadly wetland mitigation, forest conservation, and various, in fact, peat land conservation. And how can Indonesia adopt some flexible approaches where private sector can be involved on a profitable basis to do this task, because Indonesia is a very important country with huge amount of very important forests, wetlands, and other ecosystems. So please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, I would like to thank ADB for inviting me for this forum. Firstly, I would like to talk about the flexible approaches. In the Act number 32, 2009, regarding the protection and environmental management, there are multiple and integrating approaches in the environmental management. First, of course, the traditional approach, the command and control, and we all aware that in command and control we need a lot of resource to do it, and the weakness of this approach is people tends to cheat, and it's very difficult for the government to make sure that they consist with the commitment. So we need to create a market-based approach. I think the market-based approach is fundamentally try to add the beneficiary for people, not only following the regulation, but they also get other benefit on protection the environment. We already do some approaches, including maybe kind of mitigation banking, but we got different scheme with the US that Mark just mentioned, and also we have a sustainable financing institution and others approaches, and including we also have a system to what we discussed yesterday about name it as same it or name it and fame it with the proper. So we disclose information regarding the performance of environmental management of the company, so people know that who's the bad guy and who's the good guy. By that, we encouraging people to protecting the environment. Now about the mitigation banking. Actually, what we do mostly on the government drivers. So by the Act number 41, 1999 regarding forestry, like Mark said, people can use forest area for development purposes. Our figure is maybe almost 2/3 of our land is a forest area. So we have 190 million hectares of land, and 120 million of it are forest area. And it's divided into a protected forest and production forest. 43% is a protected forest and almost 47%, 57% are production forest. People can use a production forest and part of protected forest for non-forestry utilization. And for it, they need to scheme of a borrow of a forest area. To borrow the forest area, they need to provide compensation. And it divided into two. Actually, in our regulation, every province need to provide at least 30% of their land as a forest area. In Indonesia, some part already exceeding that number. So, especially in Java, 6 provinces in Java are less than 30%, and also Bali and Lampung province is in the far south of Sumatra Island. It's less than 30%. So if company or people want to use a forest area in that provinces for the commercial purpose, they need to provide a land compensation. And the land compensation is ratio is 1 to 2. So if they want to use 100 hectares of forest area, they need to provide 200 hectares as a compensation. For the non-commercial purpose, like for government, for infrastructure, government and others, they need to rehabilitate the watershed upper the forest, and the ratio is at least 1 to 1. And for provinces that still have more than 30% of forest area, for the commercial purpose, they only need to make a restoration in the watershed and pay non-taxes government fund. And for the government purpose, they only need to plan or make a restoration in the watershed. And by that scheme, we try to keep our forests as what we have now. And especially for provinces that have less than 30% of forests, we, by the compensation at least 1 to 2, we try to adding the forest area. Besides that, we also have a different scheme that we think that it need to be elaborate more in the future. For example, the PAS, the payment of environmental services. There's an example, interesting one. There's a company that provides industrial water in Cilegon. It's a city in the western part of Java that provide for steel industry and some petrochemical industries there. They need to ensure that the quantity of the water can keep and for sustainability of their business. They pay for the people to maintain forests in the upstream by $350 per hectares to keep people maintain at least 500 trees, 500 stand in hectare in that land. So people keep maintain for 100 hectares there, so for 5 years they can get 175,000 US dollars for adding their income. Besides, they still can get other benefit in that land. So that kind of maybe scheme that can. The other scheme in the Cirebon is still in Java, but it's not to the people, but between municipality. Municipality from Cirebon pay to the municipality of Kuningan to maintain their forests. So that kind of scheme, I think we need to expand more in the future, and I think that's.
Okay, thank you, Ari. It's actually heartening to hear that certain elements, at least, of flexible, market-oriented systems are already in place in Indonesia. I think it would be very good that, documenting that in a proper way and with some, more details as for the other countries and other agents in the region also can get more appreciation of what Indonesia is doing, especially how successful these programs would inspire other countries also to follow them. Now let me invite Sopalet from Cambodia to bring in some Cambodian perspective to use of this type of mitigation banking, ecosystem service payment type of flexible approach to managing the environment in Cambodia. Cambodia also is a country with very, very important lake, Tonle Sap Lake, and a lot of wetlands. I think it's very important in terms of the overall ecosystems in the region. Supalit.
Thank you very much. I was watching and listening to the presentation by Douglas and by Mark. You are lucky. You have United States, you have all the laws. You have the law enforcement in place. But when we look back into Asia, particularly Cambodia, we are only 19 years old. The country has been in civil wars, genocide, but at last we have peace 19 years ago. Within this 19 years, Cambodia has managed our environmental in accordance with the situations of our country. We used to have Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fishery to manage some protected areas. We have Ministry of Environment to protect, to manage some protected areas. But in the last 3 years, this Ministry of Environment has overhauled the environment management scheme. So we take back all the protected area to be under the Ministry of Environment. And with this, we appropriated it. And with this, we enforce regulations that is in place to better protecting our forest. And let me start divide this thing into environmental issues in two categories, into two levels. One is the subnational level, and one is national level. Let me talk about the subnational level. Like I say, we are unfortunate enough, we don't have law in place, all the law in place. We don't have the law enforcement fully be done in our country, so we have to go be more pragmatic, more flexible. Okay, so what happened in the rural area, we have 70% of the population live in the rural area. And yes, we have our offices in different provinces, and we identify what is being done in the rural areas. People are resorting to firewood for cooking, for example, and those are the source of damaging of our environment, our forest. And to solve that, this is just a classical issue. We have more issues. We have more problem, and we have solved many problems already. I just bring about some classical issues here. So to resolve that, we identify the need for cooking energy that is in demand, and therefore we were looking for markets. We're looking for investors. To do that, we introduced this technology whereby we use the coconut shell combined with waste to turn it into a firewood. And this is very successful in Cambodia. Another way to tackle this firewood issues is to introduce the biodigester. Biodigester, you have a few pigs, a few cows with their waste. You can turn it into electricity. You can turn it into cooking gas. You can turn it into fertilizer, organic fertilizer. And so far in Cambodia, we have 23,000 biodigesters operating. And this biodigester is very trendy, very fashionable. What happened is that the workers just borrow money from the microfinance, build it, 2 years later pay off, okay? And with this, we have companies, 63 micro enterprises to build these biodigesters countrywide. And with this digester, we are able to reduce carbon emissions amounting to about 335,000 tons in 5 years. So over the past 5 years, we reduced that much already. And another success story that we are doing, or pragmatic story that we're doing, is that in water, we have abundance of water. I think the chair was talking about the Lesap Mekong River. We have abundance of water, but we don't have clean water. People are using wood, firewood, to boil water so that they can drink. So to respond to that, Cambodia has introduced a local, we called it the ceramic drinking water purifier. So they don't have to resort to firewood anymore. Okay, with that, it's a very successful, an NGO from, I think from Sweden, from somewhere, I don't know, they come in to develop locally. And that reduced the cutting of logs to do the firewood. And also from that, we are able to reduce the carbon gas emission amounting to about 95,000 tons per year per annum. That is contributing. We are not looking big. We don't look at the moonshot. We're looking at micro details, and we're looking module problems so we can combine step by step. This is at the sub-national level. Our goal, this project can be very successful by our investment incentive. The government give incentive to them when to bring in the technology and innovative equipment in. We give them free of tax. Anything that can help the environment, and help the agricultural sectors as well. So this here is the example of what we have done in the sub-national level. On the national level, on the other hand, do we have times? Okay. I'm going to be very short. I touched a little bit already earlier that we have appropriated our protected area under the Ministry of Environment. We have ended the illegal logging by getting everything under one ministry, so no more big or large-scale illegal logging. And also we transfer the responsibility from the national level to the sub-national level, whereby they are taking account of any illegal logging. They are responsible for everything that's happening there. And with this, our management become transparent, become efficient, and become accountable. And because of that, we are able to sell our carbon credit to Disneyland, and we are in negotiating with 2 more companies to buy our carbon credits. And we are not stopping from there. We're not stopping there. We're expanding our forest coverage area. So now we are mapping out to build what we call the biodiversity conservation corridor. What we do is we're connecting our forest protected area together. Keep in mind, Cambodia is a country that enjoying one of the 7 wonders, what we call Angkor Wat temple, the patrimony. And this patrimony is spread out all over the countries. And anything that's around it, we protect it. So if we are able to create a good corridor among this patrimony, among this protected area, we would be able to promote, 1, ecotourism, 2, to protect better our environment, and 3, we are able to harmonizing the environment and the living conditions of the people. Let me finish by saying that our ultimate goal is that we have a country that have inherited one of the 7 wonder tourist attractions. We now have peace. We now have stability. We have economic growth over the past 10, I think 20 years, 7% in average. So what we need now is to have a very good, sustainable environment for both human and nature to live in. Thank you.
Thank you, Suplit. I think having listened to 2 countries, one observation we can readily make is that the diversity of the problems and diversity of the opportunities. So we need to be very situation specific, country specific, sector specific, problem specific in finding solutions. So with that little remark, now we have listened to two representatives from countries, mainly talking about what the public sectors are doing. Let us now listen to an investor who invested on a reforestation project in Panama. Matthias, please share your experience with us.
Yeah, thanks, Herat. As I mentioned early on, I started many years ago this ISO 14001 consultancy, and it worked very well. I sold it to a listed engineering company. I had a bit of spare cash, and I was thinking, how can I invest my money and help the planet at the same time? Sustainable investment. And I did a bit of stock market. It didn't work for me. I think I wasn't really aligned with that. So I saw this forest investment, sustainable forest investment. What attracted my attention was a project in Panama, run by a German company. Panama has two things that made it very attractive. You as a foreigner can own the land. If you invest in a fund, the fund might go bankrupt and then nothing left for you. So you own the land, so it's under your name. And secondly, Panama had tax exemption for returns on reforestation to encourage money from the private sector, from private investors going into reforestation. Thirdly, actually, this project was with a long-term management plan and with as well carbon footprint analysis and high-quality third-party verification. So I thought, let's invest in that. Even though I was aware that there are a lot of scams in forest investments schemes, so you got to do your due diligence. I went to Panama, I looked at the land before I bought it. I bought it 12 years ago, and I'm actually quite happy. I bought it for $17,000 a hectare. Last year, 2 years ago, I needed to improve my cash flow, so I sold 1 hectare for $45,000 US. Because of the personal ownership, the return is very good. I think the value now is about $70,000 US per hectare. So I actually got very good return, and it's a biodiverse forestation. It's not monoculture, it's got 7 different species, and the strategy is as well to not clear cut at time of harvest, but to selectively harvest and always have a forest there with biodiversity. So you have a rolling system that generates income. It was promoted as a sustainable pension system. That was as well the idea that attracted me. So my personal experience with that was very, very positive. But the key criteria was I own the land. It's under my name. And there is an additional incentive by the Panamanian government that you have tax exemption. And it works. I invested in another small area, and I sold it as well 2 years ago, and the money came straight to me. There was no tax at source, so no taxable income. So that law is still in existence, even though sometimes when you take the risk, you invest 12 years ago, you don't know whether the law might change, but it's still in place. The only problem is, it's a long-term investment. If you want to sell it, you don't have a liquid market. I actually, when I wanted to sell it, I sold it to a friend of mine, this 1 hectare. The other 8 hectares that I had, it was a US pension fund that came in and bought the whole area, and we were all recommended to exit, and I exited with a 100% return. So it was quite okay. But now, if you want to enter the same system, for 1 hectare, it costs $35,000 US. Land prices have gone up, legal costs are higher. And in Germany, there was an article last year criticizing a little bit that company in a newspaper that their price has gone up so much for entry level. So, you know, timing is critical from a personal investment perspective, and having the right framework conditions to make it work for you. And I got my carbon credits after 10 years, 200 tons. I could have sold them, but because I'm a green guy and I was so excited that this absorbs CO2 emissions each day, I didn't want to sell them. I wanted to keep them for myself to feel good.
Okay. Thank you, Matthias. I think we need more of Matthias in our region. I think we have a lot of opportunities to, you know, invest on natural systems like that. Even some of the social problems, like in South Asia, still dowry is a problem. If you have a daughter, you have to have some money, you know, to be donated when your daughter get married. Some smart people cultivate teak and other stuff, when your daughter is born. In 20 years, your teak plantation is, if you have a land, of course, maintaining a teak plantation is not that difficult. It doesn't need a lot of inputs like other normal agriculture. In 25 years, 1 acre, 2 acre teak plantation gave enough money to pay your daughter's dowry. These are green business opportunities. Now let me invite Simon Baptiste, who is the chief economist of the Economic Intelligence Unit, who has the access to data and other information at the global scale to bring some of the common characteristics that we need to consider in borrowing a market-based, very innovative instrument like ecosystem service payment or conservation banking or wetland banking to a developing country. What kind of the criteria we need to consider? I think Simon can elaborate on that a bit.
Thanks, Herath. Thanks, Herath. I mean, listening here in this audience, I think you might have noticed a bit of a discord between the two presentations at the beginning and then what we've been talking about on the panel, which I think really illustrates where this debate is at in Asia, which is, Asia is a very diverse region. That's something everybody says, but it's also true. And there is a real diversity of readiness within Asia. And some countries are at the state where they do have the sophistication and the capability to be thinking about things like mitigation banking, which it is quite a sophisticated approach. It's got quite heavy data requirements. It requires quite a lot of knowledge and very good institutions. Some places can do that. For example, I live in Singapore. I'm sure it could work there. There's also a lot of countries in Asia where this won't work. And the examples that we've heard from places like Indonesia and from Cambodia are actually operating at a much more basic level, which is the right point for them to be at the moment. So, to use an example from Ari's country in Indonesia, Indonesia still has an issue with enforcing regulations that exist now, let alone trying to implement a system of mitigation banking. But essentially what we're at here is trying to protect ecosystems. Yeah? And so the idea is that countries in Asia need to be looking at their national circumstances to see what is going to be a feasible solution. And the reality is that Asia is destroying ecosystems at an incredibly fast rate, and it's going to continue to do so. So that is just a bit of a fact, based upon Asia's population growth and also its economic development. So therefore the question becomes, right, given that we are going to be destroying quite a lot of ecosystems over the next couple of decades, and we've already destroyed quite a lot, what is the best approach to minimize the amount that is destroyed, and also then to optimize what we have left, right? So that given that we accept there's going to be some degradation, we want to set up a regulatory environment so that we end up with the best possible outcome. And probably recognizing that the ideal outcome is not achievable. So where can we get to in a second best sense? And for some countries in Asia, that's actually just going to be very basic regulations. Just your standard kind of conservation that maybe was happening in North America in the 50s or 60s. That's actually the best place for many Asian countries to be now. That's where you can have the highest gains for the least amount of cost. There'll be other jurisdictions where you can get a bit more sophisticated, but of course it's a lot cheaper to not destroy something in the first place than to fix it after it's been destroyed. So conservation and getting in beforehand can be a very low-cost source of mitigation banking for Asia. It also brings us to the issue of baseline. So if you're going to have a bank, you have to be comparing it against something, right? So you have to have some baseline of ecosystem quality, then you're comparing the changes. Well, we saw the example from the US about make the wetland better, you can then generate a credit. So we have to have a baseline to start from. Now, many developing countries, in Asia and elsewhere, will have a problem with the baselining approach, and we've seen this really clearly through climate change negotiations over the years, where you are not already a developed country, what is the appropriate baseline? So the US destroyed a lot of habitats, it had a baseline, then it started regulating from the baseline of we've already destroyed this stuff. Asia's in a situation in many countries of we haven't destroyed everything yet, and so there's actually still quite a lot that is in a pristine state, but business as usual would be that a lot of that would be destroyed. And should our baseline be what would happen if there's no regulation by 2030, or should our baseline be where we are now, or should our baseline be what if we adopted best practices, say from places like North America? And that is quite it's a complicated debate, firstly in terms of ethics, but also in terms of practicalities, because in Asia, the issues of measurement and data availability are really acute. There's just not the information about these things. There's also a lot of a lack of local capacity to assess ecosystem services, and as Herath mentioned in his introduction, really big issues around land ownership, so a lot of land under customary ownership, a lot of land with ill-defined property rights, and so this means that country by country regulatory design is going to have to be quite specific.
Thank you, Simon. I think now, before we go to the last round, probably we will entertain a few questions from the audience. I think I would take, the panelists can select, panelists can, answer these questions. Also, these two experts who made the presentation can join in the discussion from the floor. I think first question I would select for this is that, is there any similarity between mitigation banking and cleaning up pollution by the polluter themselves? Probably Mark would like to reflect a little bit on that.
Is mic not working? Hello. Is this one on? Yeah, there we go. It's a great question. It's a really great question. I like it a lot. So mitigation banking works, I think, for two reasons. Okay, I keep giving you reasons why it works. Now I'm down to two. The first is that projects are going to happen. So mitigation banking isn't what allows the project to happen. I'll give you an example. Where I live in San Diego, the traffic is not as bad as in Manila, but it's bad. And we've all agreed, meaning the people of San Diego, that we have to add more lanes to our highways. When we add those lanes, we're going to be expanding the highways into wetlands. It's a given that we're going to expand the highway. We have to reduce the traffic. So we have a complicated permitting system that is going to be protective of a variety of things: the air, the traffic, the noise, the social impacts, the cumulative impacts. And the mitigation banking is just one simple element to offset one of the effects of that. So I don't think that companies are necessarily buying themselves off. I think that it's a solution to getting a project done. Second point I want to make is that we've talked a little bit about the government promoting mitigation banking. And I want to make the point that the private sector is what has promoted mitigation banking. The government simply gave us the platform to do so. So mitigation bankers do not require the government to invest a lot of time and energy and money around compliance. That's what we do. So we take that responsibility off of the plate of what's referred to in this question as the polluting companies or the regulatory community. So the mitigation bankers now own this. And they take the risk and the liability of completing the project and ensuring that it reaches certain standards.
Any other panelists?
I guess I understand the sort of the technical set of sort of background that you went through there, but I feel like this question is really saying, is it okay to destroy something if I fix something else somewhere in another location? Or should it actually just, be wrong to destroy something in the first place? This is an old debate in environmentalism, and I guess I'd come back to the reality of development, anywhere, but particularly in Asia, which is if we take an approach of saying, well, we shouldn't be destroying ecosystems, then we're just going to lose, right? Because they will get destroyed anyway. Again, to return to Indonesia, quite good laws on deforestation, right? So, but we still see deforestation happening. So I think accepting that we're in a second best kind of environment, I understand the ethics of where the question's coming from, but I don't agree with it. I think it's better to replace something somewhere rather than try and pretend that we can stop any degradation happening.
I think there is another very, very relevant question. Maybe others who are interested in this combine the answer together with this. The question asks whether isn't it better to declare this wetland or whatever the ecosystem as a protected area rather than going through a banking system? Anybody want to volunteer?
I would like to actually make the point that I think we have to distinguish between different wetlands here in Asia. We have the peatlands, which are an extremely rich carbon stock that has been building up over tens of thousands of years, and that once it's being drained is prone to fires during the dry period. From my own experience and research, it's not the big companies putting on the fire, it's the draining of the peatlands that is the root cause of the haze, which has led to so much economic and environmental problems. So I actually would say that peatlands, as far as possible, should be preserved blanketly without any questions asked. But we need to have the resources and the money to support Indonesia and Malaysia with the preservation of those carbon-rich peatlands. That is my personal opinion. So I would agree with that, but we need to have the right mechanism to actually support that rich carbon stock, to preserve it, and have financial compensation for that.
Let me also respond to this question on the whether we can, rather than buying this wetland and going through a market system, is it more efficient or better to declare this as a protected area? I think part of my question is that in any country, there should be some pristine wetlands which are declared as Ramsar sites and other things for biodiversity purposes. Those should not be part of the banking system. We have to separate. Wetlands provide number of services. If it is purely biodiversity oriented and so on, probably we cannot recreate them. But we can easily recreate a wetland to provide the flood protection function of wetland. A water purification function of a wetland can be recreated. So we have to go into such details. And then look at the overall conservation management plan of a country, and then what are the wetlands which can be traded for their other services. That's one part of the answer. Second part of the answer, what is our experience with the protected areas? I think, as I remember, I wrote an article to Journal of Environment Management, 1998. My main argument is that for the purpose of biodiversity, if we properly manage the 33 million or so hectares we have put all over the world, number may be wrong, I cannot remember properly. If we manage them properly, purely without any use, letting the nature to take its own course in these lands and wetlands and water bodies, I think biodiversity protection can be very successful. But unfortunately, these protected areas face the problem of no budget, no resources. Poor people living around them need the resources. There's no way to control them. So the protected area declared by the governments are not really managed properly. That is one of the things when we are doing a study on the natural capital, we want to refocus on protected area management. Unless we put a lot of public resources to manage the protected area properly, it doesn't work. So that's why whenever we try to do biodiversity offsets for our hydropower projects and other things, when we say we will support a protected area, most of the stakeholders, including some of our board members, say protected areas don't work. They're not managed properly. There's no resource. There's no system. So that is why sometimes protected area may not be a perfect solution in one hand. On the other hand, if you declare some land as a protected land, then that cannot be used for any development purpose. So we are separating environment from the development. I think that is detrimental. That fails. That is bound to fail. If you combine development and conservation, it works. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Let me touch on this a little bit. This is from Cambodian experience. Yes, I agree with Matthias that we do have two types of wetlands, the peatlands and just regular wetlands. And in Cambodia, what we do is that we mapped out what is the peatlands. We mapped out what areas to be protected with our master plan in mind and with the corridor that we are going to be set up. These are what we do. So we already declared the protected wetland in Cambodia. We already declared the protected forest area in Cambodia. And I think it, like you say, it works. Only that you have to find the alternative, the source of income to maintain it, to keep it. You don't have to bring from the public. You don't have to bring from somewhere else. But investment, the art of investment, that's what it counts. I agree with Ritesh was talking about. You have to bring the investment to it, or otherwise this protected area, wetland, or the forest will not work. We are in Cambodia, ecotourism is what we are doing, and that, because I think we have this patrimony everywhere around the countries, that people can go from one place to another place to enjoy the environment, the nature that might works. Thank you.
If anyone else want to comment on that, probably we can take another question. Okay. Is it accurate to say that the mandate for the offsetting can only come from the government? This is a good question, which is related to actually whether private sector can also have their own self-regulated mitigation systems, rather than government putting a regulation and private sector responding. Anybody want to respond to that?
So I'll start the conversation off. I don't know if it's accurate to say this, but I can tell you that in the US, that's what happened, is that the government created the mandate for the offsetting and then stepped back and let the private sector try to turn it into a business, and the private sector was able to do so. And then, as I put up in my presentation, that system was refined and refined and refined until the point where we are at now, where there's widespread development of credits across and well beyond just mitigation banking. But one of the reasons that this works successfully in the US, and we haven't gotten into the nuances of the program, but investors have to put up capital, they have to put up cash at risk. So there's a thing called a bond, and they put cash out, and if the habitat project doesn't perform according to certain criteria, then the investor is at risk of losing that. And so we were just talking about protecting natural resources, and the payment for ecosystem services model, while it can work in many cases, there's no performance risk unless we're clever and figure out how to do that, and maybe we have been doing that. But there is very much with mitigation banking. So there's nothing like losing a lot of money that can focus the investor's mind.
Without the creation of a property right and without someone to enforce it, there's no value in what you're creating. If you leave it down to a non-government-led approach, it essentially just becomes voluntary, which is just a CSR exercise, which I think, as we heard in the previous panel, is then just a recipe for temporary or small-scale solutions.
I think my success story that I previously said, it's actually did by not private, even it's people. It's a farmer that make a forum and they maintain 100 hectares of land to have a forest there, and they get a payment from the company who need the water to regulate by that forest. So it can be done. So I think to make a comment also for the previous question, I said that actually we need to think that kind of forest or peatland or wetland or others, not just kind of a piece of land that have use for other development, but they has also function of services, that what we call it environmental service. I think we need to promote that function. I imagine in Indonesia case, like Jakarta, we experience flooding every year. So Jakarta invests a lot of money to mitigate flooding. And when the flooding, they get also loss of another billion of rupiah. So why that we can use that money to rehabilitate the upstream? So that kind of thought maybe we need to.
I think it's a very pertinent comment on the urban flash flooding, which is increasing. Some effort to restore the wetlands around these cities can really reduce the intensity of flooding. I'm sure these people, city dwellers, would be willing to pay little extra tax if they are protected from the floods, because floods damage them a lot. So these are some of the things that we can explore further. Before we go for the last round of comments from the panelists, there's a question to EPA. I would like Douglas to answer that one. The question is about the next generation compliance now being implemented in US. Will these work in Asia and support green business, technology, and innovation?
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes. I think that the green business is a critical component of environmental compliance, and one of the simplest things that Asia has an abundance of is trees. Something simple as planting trees, preventing stormwater runoff from getting into the street. That's a big push back in the States, and that's one of the we consider that to be a green solution, or supporting forestation to prevent runoff going into our water bodies and things like that. So that's definitely one. We heard about we heard about forestation and things like that up here, but the problem, and again, I can't speak to Asia with some of the next-gen compliance issues and enforcement issues, is sometimes it's easier for a company to write a check. They don't want to get involved with a large, maybe something new, novel technology that may or may not work, that they have to then monitor, they have to be responsible for. So I think that as technology and green businesses grow to solve the environmental problems, then companies will be more likely to say, okay, we'll invest in that to help us solve our problem, rather than just, in the case of us, write a check to the U.S. Treasury. But absolutely, I think there's just from what we heard from this conference today, it'll be very, very helpful.
Thank you, Douglas. I think we are now coming to an end of this discussion. Here I will invite every panelist to take 1 minute to give us a take-home message. I'll start with Douglas.
Well, keep going. I think that's the important thing that I've heard today, the optimism, and I think we have to keep working to communicate with people the importance of the environment. Often the people that are the most critical to protecting our environment are the last part of the equation. The way I phrase it in the States is we want people to be involved, be part of the solution, rather than being asked to buy into a solution. So instead of top down, we need to start looking at bottom up. What's going to work to meet the needs of the people that are actually part of the environment?
Okay. Matthias, you want to start from that end?
Our personal investment behavior and purchasing behavior can make a difference if we put our money into preservation rather than exploitation. And so be the change. That's as well what I would like to encourage all of you to do. And I have to go upstairs to prepare for the lunchtime demo, so I will make a move now. Thank you.
Just simply, I'd say that the first thing is that there's still a lot of work to be done in getting the basics right in this area, and that getting regulatory design correct is also very important.
Well, I would like to announce that Cambodia yesterday adopted the Paris Agreement, and Cambodia is part of ASEAN. We are in the same destinies, and Cambodia is on to make our destiny better, especially in terms of environment.
I think I would like to emphasize that for the approaches, command and control, market-based information disclosure and others are not an option. We need to do it integrated and mixed, because like as Simon said, it's impossible for us in Indonesia to promoting the market base without we strengthening the compliance and enforcement. So, thank you.
I personally feel that shying away from proposals as mitigation banking is not an option for Asia anymore. It's time to get private sector thick into conservation debates through this solution. The type of banking that we would like to promote would be different and would be more coherent with our social fabric and economic fabric of the region.
I'll echo that last comment, that the fact that we're gathered here and we've had such great attendance, both at the conference and this particular session, speaks to me that there's broad interest in applying this or some version of this to individual countries in Asia. And I think the time is now. How we do it is the challenge, and I'm excited to meet that challenge head on.
So this is the last comment from me on this session. I think what we learn here is that there's a huge diversity in the region. There's a diversity in the ability to enforce, create new regulation, and managing the systems. So, given this diversity, we definitely cannot have one size fits all kind of a simple approach. We need to be very, as I said, site-specific, country-specific, problem-specific approaches. But given the emerging interest on the green business in this region and the realization of the potential for that, I think we can end this session with a very positive note. Some time ago, I read an article. The title of the article is "Doing Well While Doing Good." Doing well means making profit. Good means you protect the environment. I certainly believe that there's a great potential in this region for our businesses to do well while doing really good on the environment. And let me, please join me giving a big applause for all these panelists who have really elaborated this issue and made this discussion very interesting. Thank you very much.